In this lecture video, I'm going to be presenting the epistemology of the Stoics, and we're going to see what exactly they think knowledge is, how knowledge is acquired, and ultimately the connection between epistemology and ethics. The Stoics distinguish between knowledge, cognition, and ignorance. Now, we'll see what exactly distinguishes these three things. But what they all have in common is that their origins are found in sense impressions. Now, ultimately, it's a certain kind of sense impression that leads to knowledge, but any kind of opining, any kind of an account, a rational account, anything finds its origins in sense impressions. Now, this is very similar to the early modern empiricists like Locke and Hume. But there is a difference, as we'll come to see. So we want to see, of course, the kind of early influence that the Stoics would have had on the early modern empiricists, but also the ways in which, the account of the mind of the Stoics is different, how impressions work, how knowledge, what knowledge consists in, how that's different from, the early modern empiricists. So for Stoics, impressions are self-revealing, in that they make their recipient aware of the objects that they reveal, that they're impressed by, quite literally, the mind or the soul is impressed by the objects that are perceived through the senses, that the impressions are the means of observing actual things in the world, coming into contact with them through the senses. They say that impressions are divided into those which are sensory and those which are not. So sensory impressions are ones obtained through one or more sense organs, but non-sensory are ones obtained through thought, such as those of the incorporeals and of the other things acquired by reason. So we can also be impressed by rational argumentation. We can also be impressed by just the imagination, for example, as well. We can be impressed by our thoughts. A little bit similar, actually, to how Hume distinguishes between, impressions between, being burned and thinking about being burned, right? There's a way in which both of those kinds of things imprints on us in the mind, the way that the mind understands those things and takes them into account. But regardless, all kinds of impressions, whether they are sensory or non-sensory, they are all logically prior to the operations of reason. So reason comes after impressions. So to understand reason, we have to understand the Stoic account of the soul. And remember, the soul, the Greek word psyche, which is where we get the word psyche from. The soul is not, the Christian account of the soul, which is really kind of like your identity, your true identity, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not the principle of the movement of existence of you. It's not your body, it's immaterial. The Greek, accounts of soul is often a lot more comprehensive. It's different in that it, of course, often is the principle or source of motion. But also what's different for the Stoics is that the soul is corporeal. And they say the soul is corporeal because if it wasn't, it couldn't causally interact with the body that it animates. And because the Stoics put such a heavy emphasis on the cause and effect, on the causal nature of existence, the soul itself must be liable to cause and effect. And this is, of course, how impressions are taken into account, how the soul is quite literally impressed by the things, whether sensory or non-sensory, that it experiences. Now, the soul's movements are of two kinds. One belongs to thought, and the other to impulse. But as we'll see, these aren't distinct. It's not that there's a two-part of the soul. The soul is one single thing, but it's the qualities that it engages in are two different qualities, two different functions that the same soul does. Again, one is engaged in thinking, and the other impulse. This is different from, the Platonic tripartite conception of the soul. The same thing with the Aristotelian conception of the soul. Something a little bit different as well from Aristotle, for example, is that for the Stoics, animals and plants do have the cause of movement in themselves, but it is only animals that are ensouled, meaning they have movement by themselves. So for the Stoics, plants lack a soul. The Stoics don't think that plants, or that there is, in general, they don't think there is a non-rational part of the soul, the appetitive part of the soul. The soul isn't itself necessarily, all of it, the principle of movement. It is animating. So, in the one sense here, then, we have this disagreement with Plato, that there is a world soul. It's the active principle of the world, that it's coextensive with the grosser matter which forms the world's body, and so there is no distinction between the physical world and the non-physical world. There's also then this disagreement with Aristotle, that plants don't have souls. One further thing that we should understand about the Stoic accounts of the soul is that humans possess reason, or logos, while non-human animals do not. That is basically shared by the entire Greek world. So, rational creatures are morally and epistemically responsible for our acts of assent, but they're not responsible for the kinds of impressions that we form, right? So, we have this different account of us that allows us to be responsible because of the causal nature of impressions. So we're not responsible for the impressions that we form, right? We're not responsible for the things that we experience, but we are responsible for how the impressions inform our acts of assent, both epistemically and morally. So within the soul is where cognition takes place, and the Stoics say that cognition is factive. Meaning, anytime there's cognition, it's always of something that is true. There can be no cognition of falsehoods, because cognition is a mental state that's based on its representational fidelity to the external world. It's based on the fact that whenever we have a cognition of something, it's because the impression, the cognitive impression, is of an actual thing. It represents it accurately, of that thing that exists in the world. So cognition serves as the natural starting point for knowledge. There can be no knowledge without cognition, but cognition lies between ignorance and knowledge. So we can say that a cognitive impression occurs when all three of these have to occur. 1, it arises from what is. 2, it is stamped and impressed exactly in accordance with what is. And 3, it is of such a kind as could not arise from what is not. So we can never be said to have a cognitive impression if it is of something that does not arise from what is, or if it is not stamped and impressed exactly in accordance with what it is. If it doesn't represent it entirely, right? So here, kind of correspondence theory of truth, or 3, if it is not of such a kind that it could not arise from what is not. So we have cognitive impressions when all three of these things occur. And here we can see then a disagreement with Plato and Aristotle. Now, they both thought that there are non-rational sources of cognition, because cognition is also a kind of motivation. It's also a kind of movement in the soul. Plato and Aristotle, as we mentioned before, thought there was the appetitive part of the soul, but they also thought there was the desiring part of the soul. And the desiring part of the soul is not the rational part of the soul. But cognition is rational. It is an action of reason. And so the Stoics say that there's no part of the soul which is non-rational that can be a source of cognition and motivation, that can be opposed to the dictates of reason. So the Stoics think that human action invariably reflects the assessment of the rational mind as a whole concerning what is appropriate to do in the scenario. And it is through then receiving of cognitive impressions that one begins to form knowledge of the world as it truly is. So we can have a non-cognitive impression, which is any kind of an impression which lacks one of those, which lacks all three of those criteria taken together. And it is those non-cognitive impressions that lead to opinion. So let's consider a potential objection. So the objection is that it is possible for a cognitive impression to arise from what is not. That we can have a cognitive impression, but which is based on a falsehood. And here's the objection. So Spherus went to Ptolemy Philopator at Alexandria. One day a conversation took place on whether the wise man would opine, and Spherus said that he would not. Wishing to refute him then, so Ptolemy wants to refute Spherus, saying that, the wise man would not opine, and by opine basically mean have an opinion on something. And the sage, of course, as we'll see, lacks all opinion because they possess knowledge, and opinion is a lack of knowledge. So, the sage would not opine under any circumstances. So, Ptolemy, wishing to refute him, the king ordered wax pomegranates to be placed before him, right? So Spherus would be deceived, thinking they are real pomegranates. Spherus was deceived, and the king cried out that he had given his assent to a false impression. Because, the sage here should have had a cognitive impression of a wax pomegranate and not a real pomegranate. And the fact that Spherus reached out to grab the pomegranate to eat them would seem to mean that the sage Spherus was actually deceived, that they did have a cognitive impression which arose from what is not. Spherus, though, gave him a shrewd answer, saying that his assent was not to the impression of the pomegranates, that they were pomegranates, because they were wax pomegranates, but instead to the impression that it was reasonable that they were pomegranates. So this was not a cognitive impression of things as they are, but instead what Spherus is saying is it was an impression that arose from circumstances, from reasonability. So he pointed out that the cognitive impression is different from the reasonable one because a cognitive impression is incapable of deceiving, but the reasonable impression can turn out otherwise. Because, reasonability is based on, in a sense, probability, right? What is likely to occur. That's a different kind of an assessment from, assessing what actually is true in front of you, what objects really exist in the world. Because there's either going to be a correct or a wrong answer in that case. Now, if you're not convinced of the response by Spherus here as to how it wasn't the case that he had a cognitive impression arise from what is not, we'll look at further here with pages 244. Okay, so this comes from an account from Sextus Empiricus's Against the Professors. So, with regard to the definition of the cognitive impression, Carneades says that he will concede the rest of it to the Stoics, but not the clause of such a kind as could not arise from what is not. So, Carneades disagrees that a cognitive impression cannot arise from what is not. 4. Impressions arise from what is not as well as from what is. The fact that they are found to be equally self-evident and striking is an indication of their indiscernibility. And an indication of their being equally self-evident and striking is the fact that the consequential actions are linked to both kinds of impression. Just as in waking states a thirsty man gets pleasure from drinking, and someone who flees from a wild beast or any other terror shouts and screams, so too in dreams people satisfy their thirst and think they are drinking from a spring. And it is just the same with the fear of those who have nightmares. Just as in normal states too, we believe in assent to very clear appearances, behaving towards Dion, for instance, as Dion, and towards Theon as Theon. So too in madness, some people have the similar experience. When Heracles was deranged, he got an impression from his own children as though they were those of Eurystheus, and he attached the consequential action to this impression, which was to kill his enemy's children as he did. If then impressions are cognitive insofar as they induce us to assent and to attach to them the consequential action, since false impressions are plainly of this kind too, we must say because false impressions also can lead to action, we must say that incognitive ones are indiscernible from the cognitive. Now, further here, there's just a further account from the academics, a school of skeptics that deny we can ever know anything at all. They're also going to argue against the Stoics here, saying that it says the academics are no less effective in proving indiscernibility with respect to stamp and impression. They confront the Stoics with appearances. In the case of things which are similar in shape but different objectively, it is impossible to distinguish the cognitive impression from that which is false and incognitive. For example, if I give the Stoic first one, then another two exactly similar eggs to discriminate, will the wise man, by focusing on them, be able to say infallibly whether the egg being shown is one and the same or different? The same argument applies in the case of twins. For the virtuous man will get a false impression, albeit one from what is, and imprinted and stamped exactly in accordance with what is, if the impression he gets from Castor is one of Polydeuces. So these are, examples saying like, well, look, if I show you one egg, right, and you see the egg, and then I show you a different one that looks exactly the same, well, shouldn't, the sage be able to discern which is which? Or putting two identical twins in front of the sage, shouldn't the sage be able to identify which is which? And yet, it's reasonable to think that the sage is likely to identify the wrong one of the two. So it seems like in those cases, there is a cognitive impression, right, that leads to a kind of an assent from what is not, so from a falsehood. So here's how the Stoics respond. First, the cognitive impression is not the criterion unconditionally. It is only when it has no impediment. So for a cognitive sense impression to occur, for example, one of sight, seeing something, and whether we see it correctly or not, 5 factors must concur. First, the sense organ has to concur with the object. Then the sense object, it has to be correct with what the sense organ, senses, has to be correct in the place of how it senses it, the manner it senses it, and it has to be correct in the mind. Since, if all of these but one are present, for example, if the mind is in an abnormal state, maybe it's tired or drunk or whatever, the perception, they say, will not be secured. For this reason, some said that the cognitive impression is not a criterion universally, but when it has no such impediment. So here they qualify how a cognitive impression occurs only when there is no impediment. Only when all 5 of these factors concur. When not all 5 of them concur, then an impression occurs, but not a cognitive impression. And we can identify when the error occurs by seeing which of the 5 doesn't concur. Additionally, conflict occurs, they say, when preconceptions, and we can think of these as kind of natural or universal truths that are not fully grasped, are applied wrongly to particulars. So they say preconceptions are common to all men, and one does not conflict with one another. For which of us does not assume that the good is expedient and choiceworthy, and that in every circumstance we should go after and pursue it? So in this case, the good is a preconception, and the good necessarily by definition, so we might maybe to use Kantian kind of terminology, the good by means of a priori analytic judgment determines that the good is also necessarily that which is choiceworthy. It's kind of redundant, right? Necessarily so, that in every circumstance we should go after and pursue it because that's what it means to be good. But when does the conflict arise, though, if everyone has this preconception? Well, they say it arises in fitting preconceptions to particular entities, as when someone says, he acted nobly, he is brave. And another says, no, he is crazy. This is the source of men's disagreement with one another. So the disagreement is not actually in the truth of the objects themselves, but when we judge the objects and whether they are true, whether we apply that quality to them of goodness, of truth, and so on. So, for example, they say, what is education? It's learning to fit the natural preconceptions to particular entities in agreement with nature, and for making the distinction that some things are in our power and others are not. It's the sage that is going to know when certain things are in our power and when they're not. And just as to that last example, potential objection that was given, as to getting wrong identifying which is which among two twins. Well, they say that just as he has a specific expertise which enables him to distinguish the philosopher between the true and the false in other matters, so he has to apply practice to those similarities that you adduce, like in the case of the twins. And we can see that just as a mother can distinguish between her twins by the habit of her eyes, so you will do if you practice. So, of course, right, the Stoics aren't saying that there's any kind of self-evident knowledge. The Stoics aren't saying that sages possess knowledge a priori. They possess knowledge prior to experience. One becomes a sage not because they have full knowledge of all things in the world, but through learning how to judge correctly, knowing when things, for example, are in their power to identify something, and when things are not in their power, for example, to identify something. So, what is knowledge? Knowledge is when a cognition is secure and unchangeable by reason. So, knowledge then is when it cannot, whatever that thing is that we have knowledge of, it cannot logically be otherwise. And it is determined to not be logically otherwise through the dialectical method of questioning that the Stoics employ. And it's kind of interesting how their arguments work, because they do put forward propositions, but they put forward propositions as questions that they then kind of cross-examine in order to arrive at a conclusion which is without contradiction. Opinion, though, is something, so the opposite of knowledge, is something weak and false that assent can, therefore, be disrupted by reason. So it's a kind of false assent to something that, when we apply reason to it, we can see why we ought not to assent to that thing, why we ought not to make that kind of a judgment, why we ought not to desire it. Cognition, then, as said before, lies between knowledge and opinion. It belongs to a cognitive impression. And so a cognitive impression, the Stoics claim, is one which is true and of such a kind that it could not turn out false. Of these, they say that scientific knowledge is found only in the wise, and opinion only in the inferior. But cognition is common to them both, and it is the criterion of truth. So everyone has everyone experiences cognition, but only the wise, only the virtuous, only the sage experiences knowledge. Because knowledge is not so much having a true opinion, for example. And this is where we can see as well a difference with other philosophers. Aristotle or some of the stuff that's said in the Platonic dialogues, that one can have true opinion but lack articulation. One can't have true opinion, because opinion for the Stoics is always of a falsehood, because opinion always lacks cognition. One only has knowledge then when they have cognition and they, through reason, understand why they have knowledge of it, and they have knowledge of it because when investigating it through the dialectical method, they cannot find it to be contradictory. So it is really interesting, the claim by the Stoics that the sage does not opine. The sage does not assent in the sense of making assumptions, that the sage lacks opinion then, because they don't suppose anything. Because for the Stoics, when someone supposes something, it's an incognitive opinion. When you suppose something, you're saying, well, it is not the case, but what if it were the case? And the sage never assents to any kind of supposition. The sage only acts according to that which they understand, and they only have knowledge of that which is accurate of the world. They say of further consequences that wise men are incapable of being deceived and erring, and that they live worthily and do everything well. Therefore, they also give greater attention to ensuring that their ascents do not occur randomly, but only in company with cognition. It's not the case that the sage has knowledge of all of existence. It's not the case that the sage is omniscient. The difference is that the sage has full control of their mind. The sage knows when they do not know. They have infallible control of their assent. They only give assent to impressions of whose cognitive status they are quite certain. The sage knows when to suspend judgment. It's an activity of the mind that defines the sage, that defines wisdom. Wisdom is ignorance of nothing. Wisdom is the absence of all doubt, the absence of uncertainty, of falsehood, and instability from one's cognitive state. It's very interesting, actually. It's almost a kind of precursor to Kant's notion of enlightenment, that for Kant, enlightenment is not gaining more knowledge. One is not enlightened. One does not undergo enlightenment when they learn more. One undergoes enlightenment when they learn to become a self-legislator, when they learn, in a sense, to think for themselves. And there's some similarities here with the idea of wisdom and of why the sage is wise. Lastly, we can see how Stoic epistemology ties into their ethics, because the principal philosophical motivation for Stoicism is ethics. It's about the virtuous life. What chiefly inhibits people from becoming wise is proneness to emotional disorder, not being able to identify and control their passions. And we can see this in the way that the Stoics identify ignorance with insanity. So the unstable and the fluttering impulses of the ignorant is said to exhibit false judgments, right, about what is good and what is bad for men. Whereas the sage has learned over time where these kinds of impulses come from, what they represent, to never be surprised by them again because of what they've experienced, to know, right, that the world is fated, to know then when to judge and how to judge and when to suspend judgment. So for Stoicism, knowledge is a practical disposition. And this quite clearly contrasts with Aristotle's distinction between theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom. Because for the Stoics, right, there is just knowledge of one kind. There is not a kind of techne, which is a knowledge of art, a knowledge of crafts. There is, not a knowledge, and that's different from that, which is more of a theoretical kind of knowledge, which is more scientific. For the Stoics, the scientific is at one and the same time the practical. They're the same. And this is how the Stoics, in a sense, try to show how theory and practice are united. They're necessarily one and the same. And why, when one has knowledge, they act virtuously.